Okay, before we start, I would just like to mention that your program says that the party tonight starts at 6:30, but Ron said he'll be there by 5:30 for drinks, and if you want to get there by 6 for drinks, please feel free to go to Raven's Landing if you don't have much to do in between now. Rumor has it there's a pub down there too. I don't know. But please feel free to go to Raven's Landing 5:36, have some drinks and mingle before we eat, and then we'll have the presentations afterwards, then the pub run. I'll give 30 more seconds. So thanks for coming to this last session of the day. I'm sure the panelists have been eagerly awaiting their presentations. What we're going to do is we're going to go one presentation at a time, and we're going to give them 30 minutes each. And so when they're done with their presentations, if you'd like to ask questions, we can ask questions. And if we end a little early, then we can just ask questions for the whole audience. We will have one virtual presenter, Timothy Yu, and he will be at the final presenter. So it is my great pleasure to be moderating session 9, Lifelines Across Borders, Cultures, and Eras. And our first presenters will be Victor Schmegen and Tana Timling. Victor is an assistant professor of history at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. He received his PhD in history from University of California, Santa Barbara, and specializes in early modern Japanese foreign relations. Tana is an undergraduate student at UAF studying digital journalism. He also has a passion for history and has conducted original research into the transmission of indigenous Alaskan knowledge to Edo-period Japan. Without further ado, Victor and Tana.
Testing. Is this better? Okay, I have to do the supervillain thing like this. Everybody, thank you so much for coming. The presentation title is, Alaska in Russian-American Company Contacts with Tokugawa, Japan. I'll be taking the first half, kind of giving you the bird's eye view, and then Tana is going to zoom into a very important example of something that I will be talking about. And, okay, here we go. Just to orient ourselves in time, we'll be talking about the late 18th century to the mid-19th century, to 1855. And if anybody's interested why I cut it off at 1855, more than happy to go into this in question and answer or at the reception. But I have 3 main points, basically. Alaska, and by means of the Russian-American Company, became the crucial link between Japan and Russia in the late 18th century to the mid-19th. Now, you often hear that Japan was closed off during the Edo period, so from the whole time from 1600 or 1630s to 1868. And it was not true. Japan was not closed off, but the Tokugawa shogunate that did govern the country really controlled foreign relations very tightly because they were worried about like Spanish and Portuguese priests doing naughty things like converting people to Christianity and getting them to align with the Pope. They didn't like that. So this relationship was very crucial, and in part because relations with the outside world were so tightly controlled. Every piece of information, every contact was important, and in the North, this contact was mediated by RAK people very often. The RAK and the people behind it actually had decision-making power in contacts with Japan. So it's not that somebody in St. Petersburg said jump and everybody in Alaska said how high, far from it. In fact, a lot of initiatives originated here when we're talking about relations with Japan and not there in Russia. And number three, these interactions were varied and could indeed be hostile, and we'll be talking about an instance of that. They were limited in scope very often, but they were invaluable in large part because of this way of bringing information back and forth across this divide. And this is exactly what Tana is going to be talking about. So number one, the crucial link between Japan and Russia was indeed Alaska. And when we're talking about the contact zone, I want you to be thinking about this area here, which is neither Japan nor Russia at this time. It is the homeland of the Ainu people, and this is their range. And as you see, the lion's share of it ended up being controlled by Japan, and the northern and central Kuril Islands by the Russian-American company. Now, these, even in the 18th and 19th century, were not considered to be parts of Japan and Russia. So the Russian-American company, its presence here was certainly sparse, but it was the agent and not the Okhotsk-Kontora or people in Petropavlovsk who controlled events here and controlled relations with Japan. And in the Japanese case, it was the Matsumaya clan, which was based here in the very, very southern part of Hokkaido, which was part of Japan proper, but the rest of Hokkaido was not. And this contact zone was basically, the homeland of the Ainu people, but it was broken apart in the basically turn of the 19th century. And it was administered, as I said, well, let's put it this way. You can get some of the sense of how Japanese viewed this area by looking at the name of it. They called it Ezo, which is the land of the shrimp barbarians. So certainly looking down on these people. The thing is, life, both for colonial elites and for a lot of the indigenous peoples they subjugated and dominated, looked fairly similar on the Japanese and the Russian side of this divide. Here, I think a picture speaks 1,000 words, and here we have two pictures, so that's great. But this is of the asak, the famous Russian fur tax that was levied on indigenous peoples, and if you paid it, then you supposedly became a Russian subject. This was a very exploitative practice. People were taxed twice very often, or 3 times. These were ceremonies that were backed by military force, and they were meant to be denigrating. And then you had the added impact of epidemic disease. You had the impact of overfishing and overhunting. The Russians were especially interested in furs, but as we'll see later, Japanese were also interested in salmon and other kinds of products that also depleted the environment if you utilized them. But basically, and things worked somewhat differently in Alaska in terms of there was no yasak here, but there were other systematic ways of controlling people through rituals. I mean, hostage taking was a much bigger part here. So there was a lot. And then you look at the Japanese side and you see that the visual language can often be very similar. This is I'm sorry, I keep mixing up these buttons. This is a ceremony called the Omusha, which actually has its roots in an Ainu greeting ceremony, but which was corrupted and kind of essentialized and institutionalized by Japanese authorities. Here we see a merchant and a samurai working in tandem to kind of fleece the Ainu out of most of what they have. And you can definitely see, again, the aspect of ritual humiliation in order to get access to trade goods. This person, this adult man, is being made to walk on all fours like a child and is being presented to these Japanese authorities from beneath the floor, which is really strong in Japanese language. There's actually a term for it, jigeni, and a person below the floor. You don't want to be that. So basically, the logic of colonial control by the Russians, a lot of whom were either in the Russian-American company or who started enterprises that would later be folded into the Russian-American company. We see this from very early days. We basically see that they understood each other very well. And when they came into contact, a lot of what they would do is establish terms on which these two, what I term expansionist colonial imperial states, would find a modus vivendi. And if you think about it, it's really interesting and quite significant that over 100 years before the Russo-Japanese War, Russia and Japan were dividing Northeast Asia. And this is not an aspect that Asian studies scholars focus too much on. I want to bit more about that in my career. So main point number two, the Russian-American company and the people behind it had actual decision-making power in context with Japan, and Alaska was key there. And we can see this by looking at the Kuril Islands before the Russian-American company was ever incorporated. We see people like Grigory Shelikhov and his rival, Pavel Lebedev-Lastочkin, getting their start together, kind of, by sponsoring voyages around the Kuril Islands that looked very similar to what these people would later be doing in Kodiak and in Cook Inlet, which is to say these are exploration voyages, and they're also voyages where you build settlements and where you terrorize the local population and make them pay as much as possible. And they did collect yasak from the Ainu living in the Kuril Islands. And as you shall see, they and other pромышленники, these Siberian merchants, whose holdings would also later be folded into the Russian-American company, were also very active in the region. So Antipin and Shabalin, two of these merchants, sponsored a trade mission with the approval, but not at the direction of the authorities in Siberia. They had this idea. To Matsumae, basically to Japanese-controlled Ainu lands, where they wanted to establish trade with the Japanese. Now, they didn't get that, but what they did get is a low-key approval from Matsumae clan local officials to trade through the Ainu and receive Japanese goods that way, and then the Japanese merchants would receive Russian goods that way. This worked for a while, but this was actually done without the permission of the Tokugawa in Edo. And when they found out, they were very angry, and by 1802, they cut this route off. But in the time leading up to that, these pромышленники kept building up their activities in the Kuril Islands. They founded the American Northwestern and Kuril Company in 1781. Founded an outpost on Urup Island in 1799 to funnel these goods back and forth. And then the RAK was incorporated in 1799, and the American Northwestern and Kuril Company was kind of folded into that, and along with, of course, holdings in Alaska, which were being developed at the same time by a lot of these same people. They never, excuse me, they never stopped looking south to establish trade with Japan, even though they never succeeded in that. And after 1821, when the Russian-American company was reorganized and given a new charter, Tsar Alexander I actually charged Russian-American authorities to be the ones to initiate contact with Japan from now on without even having to check through St. Petersburg. And they did that. They sent 7 missions. 7 trade missions from 1815 to 1852 to Japanese-controlled territories, all unsuccessful, but very interesting. Even when you consider the role of central initiative in these interactions, it's not always clear because, as the Siberian proverb says, God is high above and the Tsar is far away. Decisions often had to be taken on the spot. And a lot of times when these decisions were taken, it wasn't exactly clear where the line between the central government and the Russian-American company kind of separated, because we look at some people, look at some individuals like Nikolai Ryazanov, who at the turn of the 19th century was both Grand Chamberlain to Tsar Alexander I and the director of the Russian American Company, one of the primary stockholders, and also ambassador to Japan. In 1804 and 05, he was sent around the world to try and conduct a trade deal. He failed, but what he did try to do after that is to launch a series of raids to force Japan to trade. That didn't work either, but he made those decisions in Alaska, actually in Novoarkhangelsk and later Sitka, right? So basically those decisions were made here. And if you look at the Russian American Company itself, you find a tremendous number of Navy personnel serving there. And to do that at the same time was kind of, it was one of the ways the Russian American Company kept any people employed. And they really had a problem with that. And the last point I'm going to leave mostly up to Tana, except to say that information exchange was really, really crucial. And keeping with the theme of today's conference, we are going to focus on a lifeline indeed. And people who ended up shipwrecked off the east coast of Japan or lost power very, very, very often drifted up to the Aleutians because of the way the currents worked. And so thus, Tana's going to look at the way that Alaska served as an actual lifeline in Japan-Russia relations and some of the important consequences thereof. Please.
All right, hello everyone. Yeah, so our story begins with, my button's not working. Okay.
Other way.
Other way? Okay. Here we go. Our story begins in 1793, actually, when 4 Japanese sailors end up, well, originally it was more, but Japanese sailors end up shipwrecked on the Russian coast. They end up getting picked up by Russians and end up circumnavigating the world. They get repatriated back to Japan, and it is the job of a scholar by the name of Otsuki Gentaku to interview them over the years 1804 to 1807, where he documents their travels in a document called the Kankai-ibun, also translated to Strange Tales from Overseas. Here we can see a map within the Kankai-ibun that depicts the route that these sailors had taken once they had been rescued by the Russians. Starting here, we can kind of trace it going from Europe down the Atlantic around South America, back up into the Pacific, and then eventually making their way back to Japan. But most notably, the northern regions of the world are not so well depicted in these maps. However, we do know that at some point in their journey, they ended up in the Aleutian Islands because we can see that there are depictions of Aleut sea vessels, along with, of course, the Russian ship that they were traveling on. And of course, we see more depictions of Aleut culture and technology through, they show throwing boards and harpoons, as well as the living arrangements that they have. As you can see, these are kind of sod huts and, of course, the traditional hunting harpoons that are used by Aleut hunters. There's also depictions of Aleut people, as well as the articles of clothing that they wear, and kind of descriptions that we've managed to translate that kind of roughly describe what these articles are for. As a point to note here, the proportions of these depictions are quite nominal, and that will be a point for later. Again, we see more illustrations kind of describing the different technology that the Aleut people have, describing the seal gut parkas, which are waterproof and have been used for hunting on the ocean. And as I had said earlier, the northern regions of the world had not been so well mapped out. This is a different map called the Bankoku Junbutsu no Zu, or the People of Many Nations. This is an earlier map that is based off of European maps of the time, which is their approximation of a kind of a world atlas at the time. It's supposed to depict where different people from the world come from. And it is notable to point out that it has a rather xenophobic angle, as there are it takes on some like European stereotypes where there is the land of Black people or the land of women. It also depicts lands where various fantastical creatures seem to come from. But if you compare this to the Kankai Ibun, it is a lot more of a true to life depiction. I would say that is because of potential social ties that the Japanese castaways had as when they were going through the Aleutians, that they were helped by the indigenous people and of course built some amount of a relationship to where they weren't some kind of foreign other anymore. Because of growing interest in the Pacific North, we can see that through their travels, they cover not only Alaska, but also parts of Siberia. And this is from a desire to document more specifically Russians and their culture, but more generally as well, the northern Pacific beyond Hokkaido, or I guess beyond modern day Hokkaido, as tensions with the Russians were sparking a desire to understand what was lying beyond their borders. But more importantly, I think this document represents not only an attempt to document cultural exchange between the Japanese and the Russians, but it also is an important document to show cultural exchange between various indigenous groups, not only in Alaska, but as well in Siberia, with Japanese people of the time. And of course, this was a manuscript that was then taken by Japanese scholars, copied and distributed as a way to understand the world as they could at the time. But we believe that as this is a very important document for research in these types of things, but most importantly, we have a copy at our Rasmussen archive that people can use to go research, and we highly recommend that you go check it out, that it is a resource you can use. And we would love to see more research in this kind of passage through the Northern Pacific. Thank you very much.
Awesome. We have 2 copies now, actually.
Of 2 copies. Okay. We have about 8 minutes. Questions, comment. Oh, go.
Hey, thanks for. Did I turn it off? Hello. Hey. Tyler Kirk, UAF History. Thanks for an awesome presentation. I have lots of questions. I guess my big I think for both is these documents remind me of the type of ethnographic work that Russian anthropologists, colonizers, ethnographers were engaged in when they pushed east across Siberia. And so So, following the historian Yuri Smolsky's work, who wrote this book called Arctic Mirrors, are these documents? Are these documents from Japanese interactions with indigenous peoples in Alaska and Siberia as important for documenting their cross-cultural interactions, but also telling us about how Japanese people defined what was Japanese by looking at the other? I mean, in the kind of Edward Said sense, I mean, that it's just, especially the image of it looks like a Japanese woman standing next to an Unagan person is super striking up in my top right corner here. And I'm also blown away that these are at the Rasmussen Archives.
Want to talk about the image first, and then I'll move into the other part of the question?
Yeah, fantastic presentation.
Okay. Oh, right.
Testing. Hello. Okay. I think, yeah. I also found it quite striking how Japanese the Aleut are depicted there, but I do believe that is a depiction of an Aleut family. But yeah, stylistically, I'm not surprised that you'd be mistaken.
Absolutely. Like, in terms of ethnographic works and like in general conceptions of the others, yeah, absolutely. They are absolutely that. Let me actually move back to this image. And again, that's the wrong way. Again, contrast this, Stana was doing with this. This is a much more popular image. This was published. This was like sold in stores. And here you do see a lot of othering, quite a lot of othering, right? Now, the interesting thing about the Kankai Ibun and like other things like, well, there are other sources like this that aren't quite as certainly xenophobic, is these depictions and some of the words that are used, they are othering, but they're not othering in terms of denigrating. And I think that's really different in this kind of work than in some others. So for example, if you, yes, okay. Look at the words that are being used. Islander, Shimano Fuji, right? And islander women. In a lot of other documents, you get the word barbarian, right? You don't get that here. And especially you don't get that here, and this is, a theory, and Tana can talk about this a little bit as well, but yeah, it's because of these personal contacts, I think. Now, what's interesting also is that the people who wrote the Kankai Ibun were not the people who had this kind of personal contact. And there's also kind of that level of translation, but yeah, I definitely think you're onto something there. And at any point, if you want to.
Hello? Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think it's worth pointing out that while the Japanese castaways were traveling with the Russians during their circumnavigation, that I do believe that the Aleut had interacted with other Japanese castaways at this point before. So essentially that they had, I guess, the politeness to help someone in need, and that was recognized then by the Japanese sailors as like, oh, these are not like others that are somehow lesser than us, that these are people that we can relate to, that have helped us, and we don't see them as quote unquote barbarians in that sense.
Tain, I have a question for you about the material you're using from the archives. Can you discuss them? Because there are multiples, as I understand it. Why are there multiples? And what are you finding by comparing them?
Yeah, fantastic question. So do you want to talk a little bit about the composition of the Kankai Ibun and who was it for?
I guess so. Originally, it was compiled as a. It was compiled at the request of the Sendai daimyo, who received the sailors who were originally from Sendai, and the idea was that the Sendai daimyo and, of course, many other samurai and nobles of the time were interested in Russia and the Northern Pacific, as, again, at this time, Russians were interacting quite closely with Japanese people in Hokkaido and the Kuril Islands. And so there was just a knowledge gap, basically, where they didn't know much about these people and wanted to know more. And so it was commissioned in that sense. And then after there was one copy made, it was then distributed amongst scholars through private libraries and copied by hand. So you get numerous different styles of illustrations, typically showing similar things. But as far as the translations, I don't have any insights onto that. So there might be subtle differences.
Translator. They've never been translated. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's wonderful. And like, please just think about these as the products of a salon, of an intellectual salon. These were not published. And the fact that this is Sendai is also very important because they already had a tradition of scholarship on the North and also of interviewing previous castaways. So yeah, you get this spread basically by intellectuals of this manuscript. And this is, I believe, 11 volumes. And together they're like this big. It's quite a task. But again, this is something that was kind of, it was started as a government project, and then it kind of became like a leaked kind of open secret, although the original documents are not the ones that scholars can study because those are still in the hands of the descendants of the Sendai daimyo, and they're not letting people look at them. Thank you.
Okay, we have to move on. Thank you, Victor and Tana.
Thank you, everybody.
I'm sure that you all have more questions. Please feel free to ask them at any time after. And if we have time at the end of this, we will. Next up, sorry, my microphones are falling. Next up will be Cynthia Wentworth. She was born and raised in Anchorage, is a former economist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the Alaska Railroad Corporation. She has a master's degree in cultural anthropology from I'm going to butcher this, from a school for advanced social studies in Paris, France. Please welcome Cynthia Wentworth.
Okay. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good. I can go around this way. Let's see. I sometimes have trouble with slides going to the wrong place, so I might need you to help me. Okay. Yeah, I might need you to help me with the slides. So just sure. Of course. There we go. Okay. Okay. Yeah. There. Okay. And then, okay. For them to, okay.
To go forward.
And so you don't think they'll advance too fast then? Okay.
You just click it when you're ready.
Click when you're,
That
okay.
middle one.
This middle one right here?
Yeah,
Okay,
and
okay.
if you have problems, I'll
Oh, yeah, stay there. If I have problems, good.
You can go behind the podium.
Yeah, good, okay. Mary Chionik Pete was born in Toprock, Stebbins. Toprock means Stebbins, on St. Michael Island on April 29th, 1957. She attended Wrangell Institute and St. Mary's Mission School, graduating at age 16. A Jesuit priest and teacher at St. Mary's Mission encouraged her to become an anthropologist and introduced her to her mentor, Anne Shinkwin. At age 16 and a half, she went to UAF as a freshman. She earned her BA in 1979 and her MA in 1984 in anthropology. This book, Never in Anger, Portrait of an Eskimo Family by Jean Briggs, further convinced her to become an anthropologist. Never in Anger is about a small group of Inuit living at the mouth of Back River, northwest of Hudson Bay, in 1963. In 1983 and 1984, combining her indigenous knowledge with her anthropological training, Mary authored or co-authored 3 publications and contributed to 2 more. The first 2 she co-authored with Anne Shinkwin, her mentor. These are Homes in Disruption, spouse of Bruce, and Yupik Eskimo Society. She and Anne published this in 1983. The second one is one of 10 papers in this volume, The Central Yupik Eskimos, Inuit Studies. And that second one is called Yupik Eskimo Societies, a Case Study. It focuses on the socio-political structure of St. Michael Island, the Norton Sound Yupik and Inupiaq people who were there in the 19th century, and the settlement of Yupik from Nelson Island in the first decade of the 20th century, who came for trade at St. Michael Island. The latter were perceived as an alien group. This volume, Central Yupik Eskimos, Inuit Studies, is all about the Yupik of Alaska's Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta and adjoining Norton Sound. Now, Mary contributed to 2 more papers published in this volume. The first one is by Anne Reardon, who's an anthropologist, and it's called Regional Groups on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta. And the second one, also by an anthropologist, Phyllis Morrow, It is Time for Drumming, a summary of recent research on Yupik ceremonialism. Now, this volume here, Inuit Studies, is a multilingual English, French, and Inuktitut multidisciplinary scientific journal dedicated to the study of Inuit societies. It's published by the Inter-University Center for Native Studies and Research at the University of Laval in Quebec City, Quebec. And this volume here has 10 papers with 11 authors in it, and all of them are non-native except for Mary. Mary, in becoming an anthropologist, was deciding to write about herself and her own culture. Normally, anthropologists write about other cultures, not their own. But Mary attended UAF, where all the anthropologists were non-native, to learn to write about her own people. In the process, she provided crucial indigenous knowledge, ethnographic information essential to the anthropology professors. Now, Mary's third publication, authored exclusively by her in 1984, is Yupik Place Names, Toprock, a Case Study. Growing up on St. Michael Island, Mary was intimately familiar with the villages there and their ethnic backgrounds. Originally, St. Michael Island was inhabited by Yupiks who spoke Unulik, or Norton Sound Yupik. The people in Tutchik and Atrivik, you see there, were Norton Sound Yupik, as were those in Pegmiktalik and Pastulik further south. See that? In 1833, the Russian-American company built St. Michael Redoubt, a fortified trading post on the east coast of St. Michael Island, next to the Yupik village of Tutchik. You can see that there. After the Alaska Purchase in 1867, ownership of the Russian-American company passed to the Alaska Commercial Company. With the discoveries of gold in Alaska and the Yukon, St. Michael became a transfer point for passengers and freight from ocean-going ships to steamboats that could travel up the Yukon River. It also became a construction center for river steamers. In 1897, the US military established Fort St. Michael. Up to 10,000 people were said to live at St. Michael during the gold rush. It became a major commercial center. Now, Tutchik, as you see there next to St. Michael, was traditionally also an important trading center for Native people between Norton Sound and the Yukon River. This trade, the availability and low cost of non-native food, and opportunities for wage employment attracted Inupiaq-speaking people from the north, who in the late 19th century moved into the Norton Sound area in small isolated families. The people in Qikiqtarjuq and Unalakleet, you can see Qikiqtarjuq there and Unalakleet farther north, were a combination of Norton Sound Yupik and Inupiaq. The trade also attracted people from Nelson Island, who first traveled the 400 miles to St. Michael Island by skin boat on summer trading trips in the closing decades of the 19th century. They established socio-political relationships with the people in Atrivik and Tutchik. Then, in the 20th century's first decade, a small group of Nelson Island Yupik moved to St. Michael Island permanently, settling in a place called Penguk. They were called Pengurmute, and they spoke the Nelson Island dialect of General Central Yupik. So you had Unalak, or Norton Sound Yupik speaking people in Atrivik and Tutchik, and Nelson Island-speaking Yupik people in Penguk. Now, in Mary's Yupik name place name study, she explained that these linguistic differences can be observed in the pronunciation of place names. Now, the Pengur Mute began moving to nearby Topruk sometime after 1910 or 1911. You can see there, they moved a little north there, just about 6 miles, as more Nelson Island immigrants were outstripping the available supply of good land available for houses there in Penguk. By the 1918 flu epidemic, Penguk was completely abandoned in favor of Topruk. The epidemic hit Atrivik hard, causing great loss of life. Atrivik also was abandoned. Nearly all of its survivors moved over to Tetchik. But the Penguri Mute quarantined themselves in Topruk, so did not get sick. They were joined later in Topruk by people from Hooper Bay, Nunavak Island, and the inland tundra regions northwest of Bethel. So after the 1918 flu epidemic, you had primarily Inupiat and Norton Sound Yupik in Tetchik, St. Michael, and general Central Yupik speakers primarily from Nelson Island in Topruk or Stebbins. Mary was born on April 29, 1957 in Topruk on reindeer skins. When she was 5 minutes old, she was adopted by George and Jeanette Peet, also of Topruk. She came in a wicker laundry basket. She was Yupik, Inupiaq, and Irish by birth. Her birth father was from the Ryan family in Unalakleet, but she was raised Yupik. The Yupik language was the first language with which she formed and spoke her thoughts. Now, growing up, Mary spent a lot of time with Philip and Cecilia Foxy, whom she referred to as her appa and her other mother. Here's Philip. He was a drummer. And here's Cecilia. They were both originally from Penguk. Philip was born there in 1910, Cecilia in 1912, and their parents were all from Nelson Island. Now, Cecilia was Mary's mother's older half-sister. They had different fathers. But Mary was closer to both of these people in many ways than her parents, and we talked about that a lot. In late summer, they all used to go to the abandoned Catholic mission village of Akularuk for trapping and stay there in the old houses. Now, Akularuk is further south. It's about a mile inland from Nunam-Ikwa, which is just south of the south mouth of the Yukon River. Philip and Cecilia had one of the nicest houses, and Mary would stay with them, even though her parents were down there too, but she stayed with them. She never liked it when September came and her parents said she had to come home with them for school. Here's Mary as a schoolgirl in Topruk. In November 2016, one time when Mary was staying with me, she teared up talking about her closeness to Philip Foxy, who died in November 1921 of a heart infection. He was 81. And here are more photos of Philip and Cecilia. Here's Philip working on his drumstick. And here he is working on an ivory carving there. Now, Cecilia was especially known for her knowledge of the use of grass. Here, note her grass headdress, her grass necklace, and a grass braided belt. It was partially due to Mary's close relationship with Philip and Cecilia that she was able to provide so much anthropological knowledge about the communities on St. Michael Island. As I said, Philip and Cecilia were both born at Penguk. Now, Cecilia was a well-known Yupik elder and leader. She's quoted for her cultural knowledge in at least 3 books by anthropologist Anne Fina Reardon with translations by Marie Mead. One of these that was published in 1996, The Living Tradition of Yupik Masks, Agayuliaroput, Our Way of Making Prayer, and the translations were by Marie Mead. And the second book where you can read about Cecilia Foxy is 2007, The Way We Genuinely Live, Masterworks of Yupik Science and Survival. And the third book where you can read about her, Cecilia, is called Yupik Ways of Dancing. That was published in 2010. And in that book, here's another picture of Cecilia. But in the book, Yupik Ways of Dancing, there's a picture of Cecilia. She's with a group doing the akumutet, meaning northern-style bench dances. These dances refer to Norton Sound Yupik or Inupiaq dances in which seated men and women alternated in a straight line. The dancers moved in unison and sang, moving back and forth to the drum beat. Celia's in the back on this photo, the very back, performing a dance from St. Michael, but she was performing it at a Lukanuk in the 1950s. From Philip, Mary learned how the Penguik settlers got from Nelson Island to St. Michael Island and how they established themselves there and how they came to be accepted by the other Yupik, those at Tatchik and Atrivik. First, a leader of the Pengurimute gave a gift to a leader of the Tachirimute. Then the Pengurimute staged a churukuk, or a potlatch, for the Tachirimute. Literally, a churukuk means to go over to attack physically or verbally. When the Nelson Islanders moved to St. Michael Island, they were not just automatically accepted, they were alien people. In fact, the establishment of Penguik was distasteful to the residents of St. Michael Island. But by having a churukuk, which in this context means a relationship between those who are against one another, they established a relationship between the inhabitants of Tatchik and Atrivik on the one side and Penguik on the other. Elders sometimes described a churukuk as being like war, only the people opposed each other by dancing. One of the first acts of the Penguik settlers was the construction of a kazgik, which is a men's house. All men at Penguik lived in the kazgik, as they had on Nelson Island. This was a contrast from married men at Atrivik and at Tatchik, who lived at home with their wives. The kazgik provided the framework for self-government and local ceremonies. Now, this difference in living styles was very significant to Mary. She felt there was value in the traditional Yupik system shown at Penguik, in which men lived in the kazgik most of the time, separate from the women. This theme is incorporated in her first publication, Homes in Disruption, 1983, Spouse Abuse in Yupik Eskimo Society. And the research for this publication is based on 3 Yupik communities, Hooper Bay, Kotlik, and Amanguk, all Roman Catholic and all ethnically related to Top Rock on St. Michael Island. Now, originally, particularly before the epidemics of 1900, all these communities had kazgiks, where the men lived separately from the women most of the time. Older men supervised the younger men. Drinking and wife beating were practically unheard of. Women were free to leave their husbands if they were no longer getting along. Then, with the arrival of Catholicism, priests counseled men to live with their wives. Wives learned that the man was the boss and to stay with their husbands no matter what, even if they were abusing alcohol. Mary felt the origins of domestic violence were both too much togetherness and this Roman Catholic rule of to death do us part. Mary also liked arranged marriages. She used to talk to me a lot about that. Philip and Cecilia were one, and she used to tell me how it was a very good one. In the 1980s and early 1990s, Mary served on Bethel's Tundra Women's Coalition Board and on the Statewide Council on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. Her talks about domestic violence in the Catholic Church led to some productive dialogues with the Catholic priests in the area, who at the same time were starting Marriage Encounter. I was working for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service with a Yupik elder who's still living, Joe Asulip. He's from Nelson Island. And he, with his wife, Pauline, was teaching Marriage Encounter in Yupik villages and in Anchorage. And he was very passionate about it and their work. He was very good at it. In 1984, Mary wrote Yupik Place Names, Tapraka Case Study. She relied heavily on Elder Anatoly Pogayaktuk, as well as 5 other individuals from Toprak. Anatoly was born on Nelson Island in November 1908. When he was 7, his parents traveled by skin boat to Penguik. When the family arrived in 1915, the Pengurimute had already begun moving to Toprak, and Anatoly's family moved with them and the others to Toprak by the time of the 1918 flu epidemic. Mary, of course, knew many of the place names herself and their meanings. For example, Toprak means a sandy beach. She gave Yupik names to geographical features that had always had English names. Most notably, and I've written them onto this map, most notably is Kikertarpuk, for Stewart Island up there, and Asakaryak for Point Romanov. Whereas the 4 sectional maps of the U.S. Geological Survey map of St. Michael Quadrangle show only about 45 place names, Mary's project identified 255 Yupik place names for the same area. Mary found that whereas the English place names were generally for people, the Yupik names were for geographical features. Her respondents felt it was strange to name places after people. Mary absolutely loved picking berries, salmon berries, blueberries, cranberries, we used to pick together. In Yupik place names, Taprak, a case study, she wrote that salmon berry yields were variable around Taprak, that during meager seasons, the recourse was to go picking at Kotlik. And Kotlik had its salmon areas that she thought were better. And she did this through sponsorship of relatives or friends. Here's Mary with raspberries. In contrast to the Taprak people with Nelson Island origins, Mary saw too much Nome influence among Norton Sound Yupiks living in St. Michael. She never liked Nome, considering it a very racist place. She observed that the people were fatter, eating too much white person's food, and there was more drinking. In contrast, the people with Nelson Island origins ate a more traditional diet and retained more of the traditional ways. Mary greatly admired her husband, Hubert, who she was with from the time she was 15. She greatly admired his family, Hubert and Guy's family, from Tanunik on Nelson Island. They were a Roman Catholic family, but they didn't drink, and she felt that they were unusually mentally healthy. I feel this love Mary had for the people with Nelson Island origins was a big motivator for her early work as an anthropologist, and later as director of the Subsistence Division under Tony Knowles. It also influenced her strong desire to preserve and protect the Yupik language. As director of the Kuskokwim campus at UAF, she helped create a degree program in Yupik. Mary was a lifeline between Yupik and other people. She felt she and Hubert were godparents. Let's see. Okay. She and Hubert were godparents to my daughter Lily, who's in that picture, second there, whom I adopted from People's Republic of China in 1995. And Mary and Hubert were parents to 2 boys, Connor and Chase, who you see there. They were second cousins to each other. And Mary and Hubert got to know another friend of mine, also in the picture. They both connected over berries and over their cooking skills. So that's, let's see. That's it. Thanks.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much. We have about 10 minutes for questions for Cynthia.
Well, I guess I should stay up there, huh?
Oh, here we go.
Okay.
So you say she was an anthropologist, is that correct? I'm over here.
Mary Pete was an anthropologist, yeah.
And so did she get a master's or PhD?
She got a master's in anthropology.
And is she still doing that work now?
Unfortunately, very unfortunately, because she was one of my closest friends, she died in November 2018 of ovarian cancer.
Oh,
She fought it valiantly for over 2 years, but that's why we lost her.
well, thank you for sharing your life story.
Anyone else?
Any, oh, yep.
I worked for Governor Knowles the entire time he was in office and interacted with Mary quite a bit. And I think when she became subsistence director, it was a challenge for her in that there was a lot of resistance from people that opposed native subsistence. Did you talk to her much about that? Can you shed any light on what that experience was like for her?
Yeah, I can. And that reminds me of one other thing that I just made about 5 copies. You can get it. If you give me your email address, I can email it to you. But I wrote an article that touches on that was published in May in the Delta Discovery in Bethel. And Delta Discovery does not have a website that you can just access. It has 2 wonderful editors. See, Gregory Lincoln, and I'm forgetting his wife's name now, but they're great people. They live in Bethel. But anyway, my article is called Behind Every Successful Woman is a Man, a tribute to Hubert and Guyach, because Mary was really in love with her husband, Hubert and Guyach. And in this article, I talk about how important Hubert was to her with all the junk she was going through in Juneau over subsistence. And it was a challenge to her, I think. I mean, it would have been a challenge to me too. In fact, she and I first met because Hubert set us up together in 1981 when I was still living here in Fairbanks, because we were both so passionate about subsistence. Because in those days, there was so much racism, okay? There was so much, what Mary used to always refer to as anti-subsistence people. So it was a challenge to her because she was dealing with a lot of anti-subsistence people. And in this article here, I talk about some of the personal letters she wrote to me about what she was going through, trying to protect subsistence for people in rural Alaska, and how much comfort she got when Hubert, because she was in Juneau. She originally, okay, when Tony Knowles asked her to become subsistence director, she was in Bethel working for Fish and Game subsistence. And she worked for the college, KCC, for a while too. But when the first 2 times he called her, she said no. She said, I don't want to move to Juneau. But he called her a 3rd time and persuaded her to come. And it was on the conditions that she could come home in the summer. And then, of course, Hubert visited her, and he would go down, and he played the mandolin, and he liked to go down there and play music. So he'd go play, and she writes in these letters how she'd just be so stressed out from all this anti-subsistence stuff she was getting and trying to protect the people in rural Alaska, but how happy she was when Hubert got there and she could just relax. So, I don't know if I answered your question, David. Okay, yeah.
Cynthia, it was very interesting to see that Mary Pete loved to collect berries, because my only interaction with her was when she worked at Fish and Game in the subsistence division. And I remember that she was a champion for women's role in subsistence, that it's not all about counting how many things you've killed, but also all the gathering and things. And I wonder if you could comment a little more about her champion women's role in subsistence.
Well, she really did. I think she kind of took that for granted. She was a fantastic cook. You know, I had many bowls of agudok at her house. She loved to cook halibut as well as everything salmon. She used to talk about how when she entertained Gussick, she had to make sure she got some pizza or made some Mexican food, and she was real good. I mean, I still use her avocado yogurt dip too, and other recipes. She was really good at non-native food too, but when in the summertime, she and Hubert just ate salmon all the time. But when she had non-native guests, she had to make sure she had some pizza or some Mexican food, because native people, Gussick, she used to say, just couldn't eat salmon every night. So that's one thing I remember. Another time is when she liked, okay, Mary was just really interested in food, period. And so she wanted to raise things, and she wanted to have a garden. She never was able to have a garden, but she was able to take half of my rhubarb one time, and we went and bought a bag for it at Walmart. And then she dug a big hole, and I have a picture of it somewhere. She dug a big hole in front of her house in Bethel, and she put a halibut down in the bottom for fertilizer to raise this rhubarb that she'd brought from my garden. And then she would when I'd go to Bethel, she'd take me out to the farm. I'm forgetting the name of it. Tim, what's his name?
Meyers.
What?
Tim Meyers.
Yeah, thank you. Tim Meyers' farm. She would take me out there, and she didn't necessarily know the names of all the vegetables, but she'd ask me, and then she'd buy these different vegetables. We'd come back and cook them. But she went berry picking all the time, you know. She also started a thing, and I have to remember this. She had an ethnobotany program at the Kuskokwim campus, and she brought in different people, including people from Fairbanks, I know, to help run this ethnobotany program. And I'm intending to write a lot more about Mary and the things she did. And the ethnobotany program, there's a lot of stuff about gathering, because that's what women do, you know, the gathering different plants and everything. So that was very interesting to her. I never had her talk directly about greens or anything that she gathered, but I just know that she was very interested in promoting this ethnobotany program and having a documentation, which again, I intend to print of the different plants and everything in the YK Delta. But in terms of berries, I mean, you know, she just went picking all the time. And I know in the early 90s, we went blueberry picking. I can't find my pictures about that. But then she also taught me where all the good blueberries are around Anchorage. And I picked them some there this summer. She taught me that. And then when she was having her chemo, that was the most touching thing, was in 2016 when she was having her chemo treatments. She really wanted to go berry picking. And so we drove down to Kenai, and she was, you know, not feeling great from those treatments. She said, Cynthia, I don't know if I can make it. I said, if we can't make it, we'll come back, you know, and we can lower the seat in my car. And we did that. And so we went to my secret area down on the Kenai. And of course, as usual, she picked twice as many berries as me. And we had a great time. So those are some of my memories of her subsistence.
Thank you. One more quick one.
So here we are at UAF, great place. But I was working at the campus in Nome while Mary was working at the Kuskokwim campus. And I was aware that Mary and our director often had a lot of trouble explaining rural Alaska education to the people at Fairbanks. And there was a lot of issues with advocating for the rural campuses. I don't know if she ever talked about any of the issues there. You're giving me a blank look, so maybe it's no. I just remember our director and her having to often have to try to explain things and get the kind of help they needed from Fairbanks.
Or are you asking me about that?
I'm asking you if she talked about any of that or if you remember any of that.
Not specifically, but what I do, I could just mention related to that, she was such a huge help to me because when I first went to Bethel, I started out with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in the early 70s, and I worked with a lot of older guys, old enough to be my fathers, who really disagreed with me about subsistence, but they treated me with a lot of respect. So, you know, things were pretty good. But then later, when I went back to work for Fish and Wildlife Service, I worked for the Alaska Railroad in between. But when I went back to work for Fish and Wildlife Service, I went to Bethel, and I was not accepted. Subsistence, period, wasn't really accepted. But Mary and I already knew each other because Hubert and my late ex and late husband, Jake, they'd been camping out at Shack Tulik working for Fish and Game, and they were holed up in a tent for 3 weeks. This article talks about this. And during that time, they discovered, Mary, Mary, my girlfriend, works in subsistence. And Jake said, yeah, my wife works in subsistence. And there again, working in subsistence in 1981 was not a popular thing. I mean, I lost my own job with Fish and Wildlife Service for several years because the guy that was in charge then said, Cynthia represents the native point of view and not the public point of view. So I was out of the agency for several years. Okay. So there again, she and I had this bond. And I think that's kind of what you're referring to. I mean, she and I just both felt so strongly about it. And it was hard. It was hard to get that concept across to people. And it was not only hard, but like I say, in the early 90s, when I first went to Bethel, late 80s, early 90s, when I first went to Bethel, I was perceived hostilely. I mean, that was, and it wasn't that way in the early 70s. Ironically, the men just had they were all white men, but they had a higher stature. They were nice people. They were good people. But later on, they did not want a woman promoting subsistence. And so, of course, where did I go? I mean, with Mary, so yeah. Go ahead.
Oh, no, thank you so much, Cynthia.
About,
we're out of
anyway.
time. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
That was wonderful. Once again, if we have time at the end, please ask more questions. There's Tim. Our final presenter is Tim Yu. Excuse me real quick. Tim, you will be presenting, his presentation title is Imagined Reminiscences, Ecofeminism in Alaska. Timothy is a PhD student in ethnomusicology at Florida State University. His research centers around how singer-songwriters in Alaska engage with the frontier as a myth and concept through original music, as well as expressing their attachment and relationship to Alaska's land. And I just want to mention that I have had 2 different attendees today say that they are really excited for this presentation. So go ahead, Tim.
Hello, let me just share my screen real quick. So, making sure we're all, can you all see this? Can you all see my screen?
Yes. Can you go into presenter? Oh, no, we're good. We're good. We're good. Thanks, Tim.
All right. Okay, I'm gonna start. I want to first thank the Society for this wonderful opportunity to present at this conference. Due to financial concerns and teaching responsibilities at my university, I'm unable to attend the conference in person, hence I ask for your patience and forgiveness as I present virtually from Tallahassee, Florida. My presentation today is a result of ongoing ethnographic and archival work as part of my dissertation project, so I welcome any feedback. You can reach me through my email. And for this presentation, I slightly modified the scope of the paper. Instead of 2 song studies, I will focus on 1 for the sake of time. In this article, I take a closer look at the music video, All for the Klondike's Gold by Alaskan singer-songwriter Annie Bartholomew and producer Paige Sparks from Bartholomew's album, Sisters of Whitechapel. As one of the only 2 songs with music videos from the album, I argue that All for the Klondike's Gold as an original work of music and music video combined as a powerful, cohesive audiovisual text that addresses the lack of documentation of women's lives during the Klondike Gold Rush and goes against a historically masculine approach in viewing the natural environment within a settler colonialist framework. Through the lens of transmediality, my analysis discusses how Bartholomew and Sparks weave musical and visual elements together through a rich thicket of intertextual strategies, and as a result, All for the Klondike's Gold becomes an audiovisual text brimming with ecofeminist values. Sisters of Whitechapel is an independent songwriting project and studio album that was inspired by the narratives of women during the Klondike Gold Rush in the Alaska-Yukon area during the late 19th century. Through extensive research on historical materials on women's narratives, including newspaper articles and diary entries from the turn of the century, Bartholomew's album aims to shed light on and celebrate the women who came up to the north for better lives, in particular sex workers who were employed at the red light districts in the Klondike. This wouldn't be a musicology paper without any music, so I want to play everybody the music for All for the Klondike's Gold, and we can all listen to some great music. So here it is.
In the deep snow of Chilkoot Pass, my husband lost his life. I know his prayers to the last were for his lovely wife. I lost my husband, you your son, you your brother bold. Then let us weep our griefs to one, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the Klondike's gold, my love, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the love of golden gain, all for the Klondike's gold. He's buried in Yukon sand beneath its angry wave. No headstone in that dismal land does mark his lonely grave. You lost your husband, I my son, and you your brother bold. Then let us weep our griefs to one, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the Klondike's gold, my love, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the love of golden gain, all for the Klondike's gold. help him long. He left me here in the old home to join in your sad song. You lost your husband, you your son, now my brother bold. Then let us weep our grief so one all for the Klondike's gold. All for the Klondike's gold, my love, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the love of golden gain, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the Klondike's gold, my love, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the love of golden gain, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the Klondike's gold, my love, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the love of golden gain, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the Klondike's gold, my love, all for the Klondike's gold. All for the love of golden gain, all for the Klondike's gold.
So I hope you all enjoyed this kind of old-timey bluegrass sounding music. And this song is really interesting because Annie has adopted this from an anonymous poem that was first published in the Daily Klondike Nugget on April 27th, 1900. Bartholomew adopts a first-person perspective, inserting herself into the shoes of the women who lost their loved ones in the Klondike. In the original poem, the poet recalls a conversation that they overheard from 3 women. More than a century later, Bartholomew adapts, transforms, and audiolizes the poem into music, a process that starts with a form of auditory imagination. Consequently, I argue that Bartholomew's audiolization is inherently intertextual. Here I adopt Julia Kristeva's definition of intertextuality, in which she defines intertextuality as a permutation of text and intertextuality in the space of a given text server utterances taken from other texts intersect and neutralize one another. Hence, the lyrics from All for the Klondike's Gold is weaved within a network of what Michael Retterfier calls an aleatory intertextuality. The same text is perceived by different individuals based on subjective experiences and even across time. In this case, between Bartholomew in 2023, the poet in 1900, and the 3 women's conversation as the earliest point of reference for this kind of intertextuality. Opening with shots of the natural environment and sounds of birds, Annie appears at the center of the frame, twirling her white long-sleeve dress against the darker hues of the Juneau woodlands. As Annie sings the first verse, "In the deep snows of Chilkoot Pass, my husband lost his life. I know his prayers to the last were for his lovely wife." The camera shifts our attention to the 4 women musicians at the center, wearing similar earth tone dresses like Annie, blending in with the natural environment. When the women get individual cameos, they seem to blend into the intentional overexposure of the camera and the overgrown trees in the background. The second part of the chorus, highlighted by a repetition of the phrases, "All for the Klondike's gold, my love, all for the love of golden gain," is complemented with the women wandering in the forest as Annie occupies the focal center of the video. Later on, all of the women stand close to each other in the woods, playing acoustic instruments typical of an old-time setup that coalesce with the hues of the moist, velvety, moss-covered forest. And so, All for the Klondike's Gold articulates a neglected part of history. The gold rush at the turn of the century marks the country's final excursion towards the last frontier in Alaska, where brave stories of pioneering men, colonial settlers, and gold miners have been told in 19th century dime novels and early 20th century westerns. Under the grand narrative of Manifest Destiny, Frederick Jackson Turner's frontier thesis famously highlights the significance of the American frontier and celebrates the continental migration of white settlers to the, quote, free land in the West. Such notions of rightful and justified dominion over nature are inherently masculine, as ecofeminist Maria Mies remarks, which portray nature as, quote, frail, submissive, and sentimental woman, one that is dependent on the man as the protector, colonizer, and conqueror, unquote. Similarly, historical narratives of the gold rush have often been told from the men's perspective, often excluding and casting aside women's contributions during the gold rush. As historian Barbara Kelsey remarks, male stampeders rarely included women in their diary accounts, as they either hid their extramarital affairs or they simply viewed women who performed domestic functions as invisible. While Bartholomew and Sparks did not know of the term ecofeminism, the aesthetics of the music video are far removed from typical masculine depictions of Alaska's natural environment. All for the Klondike's Code presents a special relationship between women and the Alaskan land, a sense of harmony between humans and the natural world instead of exploitation and extraction of resources. By incorporating natural sounds like bird calls and imageries of moss, fern, and wildlife into the music video, as well as filming scenes where the women come into close contact with the natural world intimately, Bartholomew and Sparks' creative intertextual interpretation of the original poem is translated into the audiovisual. Using the lens of transmediality as defined by Thomas Dabrowski, Agatha Hanley, and Thomas Fysiak, All for the Klondike's Code can be considered a transmediated audiovisual text. Bartholomew and Sparks transforms the original text as a mere recollection of lost loved ones into a powerful ecofeminist message. Therefore, All for the Klondike's Code is not what the site title suggests, conquering the frozen wastelands of the Klondike in search of hidden treasure, but rather it is a tribute to the women whose voices and lived experiences have been overshadowed by the dominant masculine narratives of the Klondike Gold Rush. Reaching the second chorus, Sparks interspersed with individual medium and close-up shots in the women saying the lyrics, "I lost my husband, you your son, and you your brother bold. Then let us weep, our griefs are one, all for the Klondike's Code." At the same time, we can see the women standing in a box-like formation and facing outwards, while another frame captures the four women now standing behind Annie, staring at her with intent. In an interview with Bartholomew and Sparks, Bartholomew explains her fashion choice in the video. Quote, "I love the idea of white being the symbol of purity. These women, you know, they were forlorn women, they were sex workers, women who didn't have virtue. There's a holiness to everything and redemption is possible. And it's kind of funny that it is a wedding dress because I feel like the women were kind of wedded to their profession and wedded to each other, you know?" It is unclear whether the women from the original poem were identified as sex workers. However, Bartholomew's dress and her statement suggest a sense of solidarity between the sex workers and other women who came north during the late 19th century, despite having not too much concrete historical evidence. Nonetheless, Bartholomew's music responds to an overarching theme in how narratives of the gold rush, be it fictional or non-fictional, were dominated by men, and these women's stories were mostly buried in history with little documentation. Instead of considering Klondike women's stories as individual ones, Bartholomew binds these stories together as what Sarah Ahmed coins as a, quote, feminist tapestry, each interwoven and told with each other, quote. For Bartholomew, the white dress symbolizes purity, which contradicts with the unvirtuous natures of sex workers, in quotes. To bring in Thomas Torino's interpretation of Persian semiotics, the wedding dress serves as an index and indexical sign for marriage. Indeed, a lot of single women who came north were showered with marriage proposals almost immediately after they arrived. But on the other hand, the wedding dress also signifies a relationship between sex workers in the Klondike and the profession, a sense of commitment to their job for survival. Therefore, Annie and the women's white dresses serve as indexical signs for the women who married miners and prospectors for some sort of economic stability. Yet this is also a sign, perhaps with irony, for sex workers who were determined to make a living out of, quote, being wedded to their professions, unquote. Throughout the video, Bartholomew and the four musicians move around the camera frame like ghosts and spirits roaming the forest, gracefully gliding in and out the woods as if they were playing hide and seek with each other. An obvious reference appears as the song comes to an end. The video lingers on for 22 more seconds, interspersed with bird sounds, as the women gradually exit the main frame of the camera slowly. In an interview with Paige Sparks, she describes the women as ghostly in the video, like spirits walking the land of Juneau and Southeast Alaska. In a way, Bartholomew's intertextual interpretation transformation, and personification of the original text, combined with Sparks' creative choreography, offers agency to the women who were not only present during the gold rush, but often occupied important jobs such as adult entertainers in a male-dominated space in the late 19th century, in which their stories are often untold. I see Bartholomew and Sparks' work as a kind of, quote, literal archaeology, as coined by Toni Morrison, reconstructing the world with a little bit of guesswork and information left behind. With the audiovisual text of All for the Klondike's Gold, Bartholomew and Sparks highlight the nameless souls who have once led brave lives in the Klondike. Finally, it is crucial to recognize All for the Klondike's Gold as a product of transmediation across time, through which layers of intertextual meanings are added on top of each other to expand semiotic potentialities by utilizing the textual and the visual. The history of Alaska surrounding that of the Klondike Gold Rush has always centered around tales of brave men mining gold amid harsh weather conditions, with little to no regard towards the women who were instrumental to the sustainability of frontier towns in the Klondike. While the moniker Last Frontier yet lingers on in Alaska, this article demonstrates some of the ways in which Bartholomew and Sparks counter against dominant historical narratives through songwriting and the visual medium of music videos. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Tim. That was wonderful. Questions for Tim? We got 10 minutes. Oh, sorry. All the way in the back. You're the student in the back.
Thanks so much for that, Tim. A lot of us here got to hear Annie's music at the 2019 Historical Society conference in Kodiak, so it was nice to see how it's developed. I was wondering how you first became aware of her music.
I knew this question was coming because I am from Florida. I would say it was out of coincidence and a sense of curiosity. I was graduating from a master's program and I was doing something completely different else. But as I looked into my own field as a discipline, I realized that a lot of musicological research is being done in places that are already well known for their music. And the US is such a great and big country. And one day, it's out of coincidence, I was just looking at Google Maps and I was wondering what happens in Alaska. And my love for folk music came in. I typed up Alaskan folk music and I was led into this rabbit hole in finding Annie's music and then other singer-songwriters as well. And of course, for this presentation, I can only include one, but I've met so many friends along the way. So I have to thank Annie all the time for her work as well. But that's how I got roped into Alaska, I guess. And ever since then, I have had this kind of sense of weird calling. So I've tried to go back as much as possible.
We saw you nodding your head at the music. That was funny.
I applaud you for taking this on and your interest in it. So define ecofeminism. Is that basically what this woman does in her songs? Define that for us.
So ecofeminism is a term that emerged out of feminism. Basically, anything that's a violation or exploitation of nature constitutes as a feminist concern. Even though Annie and Paige didn't necessarily know the term ecofeminism, I am trying to argue for a point where by putting women as in connection with nature, they're portraying this ecofeminist message where they believe that women and nature are in spirituality together. So contradicting most masculine narratives of the gold rush, where it's a lot of exploitation of nature, kind of going to these forests and kind of taming the wilderness kind of narrative. The music video here portrays another kind of living with nature, where you're basically in a part of nature. And this is also kind of comes from my ethnographic research with Annie, which she always talks about how nature is a huge part in her songwriting. And if you're in Alaska, you can't escape nature. And so that's kind of where I got this ecofeminist idea, which is drawn from the early work of Maria Mies in my presentation as well.
We got a question over here, Tim.
Hi, I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the other women artists you're focusing on.
Well, where do I begin? There's a lot of them, and one particular one that I wish, if I had to submit another abstract, would be about this amazing singer-songwriter called Marian Call, who's active in Juneau, but previously she was in Anchorage for like 20 years. And she's very well known, I think, for her music using humor to kind of engage in, engaging in living with Alaska, kind of describing Alaska lifestyle through her music with humor. And one of her songs that I love, absolutely, and it's going to be part of my dissertation as well, is I Wish I Were an Alaskan Girl, which is a really interesting song, full of humor, kind of contradicting these stereotypes with Alaskan women or Alaskans in general, but it's a very funny kind of song to kind of describe living in Alaska. Another songwriter that I also included is Liz Snyder from Juneau as well. She's now part of a group called the Whiskey Glass. And then there's another younger generation singer-songwriter named Ava Earle. So she kind of represents kind of the newest generation of singer-songwriters from Alaska. So she's from Girdwood.
I have somebody to recommend, which is Susan Grace
Okay.
from Fairbanks.
Let me write that down. How do I spell it? Sorry. Grace.
So Susan, S-U-S-A-N, and Grace, G-R-A-C-E.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm going to look into that.
Questions and any other questions? Okay, well, thank you so much, Tim, and thank you, Cynthia and Victor and Tana. We appreciate you coming all the way from Florida, and that was excellent.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Hold on.
People, I'd like to have a copy of, because this has to do with Mary Pete's feminism too, which this presentation reminds me of. This other article I have, which particularly you, Carol, and Ted Krieg, who knew Mary well, I'd like you to have copies of this. And also, if anyone else would like a copy on email, you could just email me. I could give you my card, and you could have a copy of it, because it gets at some of these other feminist issues too. I'll give you a copy right here. I'd like you to have a copy. I'll just hand that to them. Give one to Carol back there and to Ted Krieg, because they both worked with Mary. And anyone else who'd like one too, I have more copies here.